Well, let's bring in Marcus Papadopoulos now for some insight into the situation in Munich. He's the publisher and editor of Politics First and a regular commentator on Russia and the Balkans. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for joining us then. So the French president says that the east of Ukraine should be given greater autonomy. Now, that idea has been floated beforehand, but it was rejected by Kiev. Why is it a proposal now?
If I'm going to be brutally honest and realistic with you, whatever is discussed this Wednesday, whatever is decided upon this Wednesday, for example, about special status for eastern Ukraine, it will only be a short-term remedy for the crisis in Ukraine, because a long-term remedy for the crisis in Ukraine is the American government abandoning its objective of trying to bring Ukraine into the West's orbit, of trying to bring Ukraine into NATO. That's why there is a crisis in Ukraine today, because ever since Ukraine's independence in 1991, the American government has spent billions of dollars in trying to lure Ukraine away from Russia into the European Union, into NATO, in order to weaken Russia on its western borders. So quite frankly, whatever proposals are put forward, it will only, and agreed upon, it will only be a short-term piece, because if there is an agreement this Wednesday, for example, about a special status for eastern Ukraine, it will only be adhered to by the West and by the Ukrainian government for maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But at some point in the future, there will be another conflict, because the Americans quite simply will not drop their goal of trying to bring Ukraine into NATO. That would be a severe threat to Russia's national security, and Russia will not tolerate it.
Well, looking at the approach then and the rhetoric from the EU and Washington in the last few days, is there an ever-increasing divide between the two, do you sense?
There is certainly a division between the Americans and the Europeans about how to proceed in regard to Ukraine. But it's very important to note this. Europe is a strategic ally to America. And when push comes to shove, allies will back each other. So if we take the sanctions, which were imposed last year on Russia, the Europeans were very reluctant to impose sanctions for economic reasons on Russia, but they were forced into it by the Americans. But nonetheless, the Europeans went along with it. Now we're hearing that the Americans are seriously considering supplying arms to the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian paramilitaries, which would pour more petrol on the fire in Ukraine. But the Europeans are hesitant about that. However, if the day comes when the Obama administration decides to start supplying American weapons to the Ukrainians, then Europe will go along with that. It doesn't mean that the British and the French and the Germans will start supplying their own weapons to the Ukrainians, but it will mean that there will be a united front.
Do you see this as a likely move then from Washington? Do you see a day where they do start shipping weapons to Kiev?
Well, I think we shouldn't be under any illusion that the Americans haven't been providing military equipment to the Ukrainians already. And I think if we look at history and if we look at the present, the Americans have a very, very nasty history of supplying weapons to some odious groups, which makes a conflict even worse. Look in Syria. The Americans are supplying arms to Islamist militants, and their allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey, are also doing the same. So going by history and going by what's happening in Syria at the moment, I think is a distinct possibility that the Americans not only are already supplying arms to the Ukrainians, but also they could increase the amount of American weaponry going to that country, which of course will be fateful to Ukrainian civilians in the east of the country. It would be absolutely dreadful.
Well, we've heard from German representatives that Russia has to be integrated into any global security system. We're hearing that Washington could ship arms to Kiev. Is this a good cop, bad cop approach?
Well, once again, Germany is a strategic ally to America. And yes, Germany has very close bilateral and economic relations with Russia. But as I said just now, when push comes to shove, allies stick together. Germany was reluctant to place sanctions on Russia last year, but they went along with it because America was demanding it. So I think we will see a similar situation unfold in regard to Russia's place in the world. And let's not forget that the Americans are constructing a missile defense shield in Eastern Europe, which is aimed at Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent. There's no opposition from that from the German government. So I'm afraid to say it doesn't bode well for the future.
OK, Marcus Papadopoulos, publisher and editor of Politics First and commentator on Russia and the Balkans. Thank you very much for joining us here on RT International. Now back to our breaking news here.